Let's look at those external influencers that people have to really influence the sensory profile of Chardonnay. So there are 5 of them, 5 different levers that can be used to really influence the end results, what you are going to taste in the bottle of wine you are going to purchase. So we talk about climate and harvest timing. So cool climate, warm climate, the ripeness of the fruit at harvest has a lot of influence in the final composition of the taste and the aromatic composition. The malolactic fermentation, which is a secondary fermentation. So initially we do an alcoholic fermentation to transform the sugar from the berry into alcohol, and other things happen as well. There is a secondary fermentation that is optional, which is called malolactic fermentation, and we will touch on that in a minute. The oak regime, whether we use oak treatments, traditional one is oak barrel with different toasting levels, so the wood being burnt at different degrees, and it will influence the type of aromas or components that can be extracted by the wine from the oak barrels. But also nowadays we have different ways of adding oak influence or oak regime in the wine by the use of chips, cubes, stave in a vat to get that oak exposure for delivering particular aromatic or mouthfeel component. And then when the wine is aged in barrels, the winemakers can decide to, do some lees aging, so aging on lees, and the action of, I will use my French accent, bâtonnage, which will help homogenize the yeast and the wine. We can talk about that in a minute, but that's another way to extract more aromatic compounds, more texture compounds from the yeast and the oak. So that changes again the flavor of the wine. And then there is the management of oxygen. Oxygen can be really a threat to winemaking because the wine oxidizes and then it tends to create some bruised apple characteristics or sherry like type of aroma. But some people also prevent the exposure to oxygen, and we'll see that it becomes a stylistic choice. So all these 5 levers. So let's see each of them. So malolactic fermentation. It's really an optional fermentation after the alcoholic fermentation that allows, by the use of bacteria, to transform this acid, the malic acid that is in the wine, that is very, give the very crisp sensation in your mouth, into lactic acid that is softer, so the acidity is less pronounced, less sharp, and it gives also a creamy mouthfeel. If you don't know what malic acid tastes like, it's really the acidity that you have in your green apple. Purchase a green apple and then, bite into it, you will perceive the acidity, your mouth will water, and you will have this sensation of acidity. After that, taste a lemon, and the acidity of a lemon is very different. But just to give you an example, the difference between malic acid that you find in the juice and the citric acid of lemon. We don't have citric acid in wine. We have only that malic. But then the bacteria transform it into lactic. So the mechanism is that it converts that malic acid into a softer dairy-derived lactic acid. The biological process produces diacetyl, which is a compound responsible for the buttery aroma. And when I think of diacetyl, for those of you who go to the movie theater, especially in North America, and you buy popcorn with buttery aroma, that's what it smells like. At high concentration, diacetyl smells like butter flavor in popcorn. That's really my reference. At lower concentration, it's more like creamy type, but it can go high. And you have Chardonnay labels now say like it's butter Chardonnay. So, some people like it. But diacetyl is one of the byproduct of this fermentation. And there are also other compounds that will evoke more like a yogurt type lactic note or more a cream aroma. So we talk about creamy texture, but there is also the creamy aroma that can be a bit different. Sometimes you associate the two, but they can be separated. You can have a creamy aroma without the texture, or you can have the creamy texture without the aroma. But in the wine after malolactic fermentation, it tends to be both of these sensations can occur. And there have been some confusion among consumers that, the buttery note in Chardonnay is coming from oak. No, it's coming from the malolactic fermentation. But you can have a nice oaky Chardonnay that is very well integrated that doesn't taste like butter. It's possible. All right, that's the malolactic fermentation. We talk about aging the wine only. So it happens when the wine is in the barrel and, the winemaker can choose to remove, after the fermentation, to remove the yeast, or it can choose to leave the yeast inside the barrel. So the yeast, after the fermentation, the alcoholic fermentation, they have done their job, so they are dead. It's sad, but they are there. And if you leave the wine in contact with the yeast, there are some biochemistry that is happening. So some components from the dead yeast cell are extracted, and it gives, the wine different characteristics. So here, it gives you, the creaminess as well, more like the body, the full body, what I call weight, but also some kind of bread dough flavor, aroma. And then when you age wines in oak, you have this oak lactone, vanillin aroma, even some volatile phenol that gives the smoky character or the clove character in the wine that can be extracted by the liquid from the oak. So aging in oak barrels alters both the flavor chemistry, but also the physical mouthfeel of the wine. So that's where, we say winemaking is an art and science. I always say science first, but there is art in managing as well these different components, because it can be very complex. Finally, in terms of the external levers that influence the style, the stylistic choice of the winemaker in terms of the Chardonnay, managing oxygen, can be a choice. So there are different schools. Some people really want to prevent any oxygen exposure, and they tend to protect the wine from oxygen. They make fermentations in stainless steel vats, and the result is that volatile sulfur compounds tend to develop during fermentation. And that's how you get those struck match, flinty aromas that are developed. And that could be considered a quality or a fault, depending on how sensitive you are. And if you have had the chance to taste Chardonnay wines from the Chablis region in Burgundy, they traditionally don't use oak. They always do wine in stainless steels. And that's the first time I heard about flint aroma in wine, was a tasting in Chablis, and was just like, what is that? And yeah, it smells like flint. It's not the dominant, but it can be, part of the experience. The other way to manage oxygen is, to let the wine breathe. And oak barrels are also a good way of managing oxygen in that way. So you control the oxygen exposure. You want a bit of oxygen, but you don't want, oxidation. Like, you don't want wine to turn bad. And you let those tertiary aroma development, so those more evolved aromas going into like more brioche, more baked fruit, dried fruit, honey-like flavors that are produced with a bit of oxygen exposure in the barrel. So there is no right or wrong ways of doing it. Some people like a bit of reduction in Chardonnays, some don't, but we can have debate. It's all about your preference. So we saw about the core characteristics, the 5 levers that can influence the sensory profile. So what is really the result? We can really summarize those different influences into a 4-quadrant map, where you have cool climate influence, winemaking with a reductive approach. In one corner, a more cool to moderate climate with lees age characteristic, more barrel fermented, so making wine in the barrels with some oak influence, to the more oxidative approach of having more evolution in your wine before bottling it. So that's the wrap up for Chardonnay. I want to go into the century practice, what we are going to do, and give you a bit more pointers into the next step.